So there's only ever going to be one title for this video, right? The Brooklyn Nets are a disaster because they are, and the events of this season and the years prior all led us to this point where the Nets are the most dysfunctional franchise probably in professional sports. But you know what's happening right now. You know what's happened this season, but from someone who has lived through this way more closely than anyone ever should have given the events of the last couple of years, someone that is a Nets fan that has been through this whole era of anticipating and expectations and everything that has happened in the last couple of years, let me tell you exactly how all this broke down and how insane it is that it's led us to this point. So of course, let's go back to 2019, right? The season prior to KD and Kyrie arriving in Brooklyn. The Nets have been building something for a couple of years. Kenny Atkinson was there as head coach. Sean Marks was there in the front office. Sean Marks is still there in the front office as the general manager. And they were trying to rebuild a team that had given away all these future draft picks in what is largely considered the worst trade in NBA history, where they traded away all these future first round picks for aging veterans that ultimately did nothing. The team broke down, injuries broke down. Darren Williams, Brook Lopez, Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett. It was a disaster. They were the worst setup team potentially in the history of the modern NBA. And Sean Marks and Kenny Atkinson did a fantastic job of rebuilding the team, rebuilding the roster, even without those future assets. They got late first round picks from other teams in exchange for veterans on their roster. They ended up getting guys like Jared Allen, who ends up becoming an all-star, Karis LeVert, who's been traded multiple times for first round picks, who's now in Cleveland. Both those guys are in Cleveland. They brought in guys like Spencer Dinwiddie and Joe Harris and developed those players into real usable assets, all leading to the point where they had someone like D'Angelo Russell on the team that they could either re-sign or eventually trade to Golden State in exchange for Kevin Durant and put themselves in a position to be a real star destination. And as soon as the Knicks screwed up, the Nets were right there. They signed KD, Kyrie, and DeAndre Jordan, and they were off. And that plan that led them to 2019 was almost flawlessly executed because it was something that everything had to go right. The front office had to do so many things in terms of cap space, in terms of hitting on these draft picks, in terms of continually raising the value of assets above what they were when they got to Brooklyn. D'Angelo Russell was not an asset when he got to Brooklyn, and he ended up being something that now in the league is like a borderline all-star at times. Karis LeVert was a guy that struggled with foot injuries in college and has become a good player. Jared Allen was a raw prospect as a player and has ended up becoming a really good player. Joe Harris, Spencer Dinwiddie, these are guys that were G League players when they got to Brooklyn. And Sean Marks and Kenny Atkinson built that roster up in a way that it looked appealing to someone like Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, not only wanting to do their own thing in Brooklyn and having the control that they would ultimately have in Brooklyn, but the roster looked like it would fit as well. When you compare that roster to what they have right now in Brooklyn, it's hard to imagine how the exact same front office, Sean Marks is still there, the same front office that did everything right in the years prior to 2019 in such a disadvantageous situation without assets, without first round picks, with aging veteran players on the roster, has screwed everything up so dramatically from 2019 on to this point, to the point where now they have had more head coaches than they have won playoff series since they have signed Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving in 2019. And that is an unbelievable, series of events to get to this point. And there's a lot of things to discuss, and whether they're going to, eventually turn it around under what is presumed to be Ime Udoka as the head coach moving forward, who knows? But there is a lot to talk about. And ultimately, I think you really have to start talking about like whose fault this is, right? Like who to blame. And pretty much everybody is, right? I think primarily we can talk about the most newsworthy thing, which is Steve Nash as the head coach. I don't think Steve Nash was a very good NBA head coach, but I also don't think he was in the top 4 of reasons that this thing completely fell apart in Brooklyn, because Steve Nash was a first-time NBA head coach, and he was not a guy that had a ton of experience on the bench even. He was like a consultant doing stuff with the Warriors, had a good relationship with Kevin Durant, and they brought him in because of that relationship with Kevin Durant, of course, his success as a player, and they thought, well, this guy is going to be a really good coach. And I think in certain situations, Steve Nash could have thrived as an NBA head coach. I think offensively, there's clearly a lot there in terms of what he could figure out in terms of, the structure of the offense and things like that. And I think his personality, his demeanor would have fit on certain teams, but not this one. And I think it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that he did not have, control isn't the right word, but he didn't have, the right demeanor to deal with these stars. And it felt like they kind of just walked all over him. And it was just never a good situation. I think ultimately that's why he left, because he didn't feel like those guys were listening to him anymore. And now we get to this Udoka stuff, and it's weird, right? Because the one time in this Nets Kyrie era that the Nets have been good was when Ime Udoka was on the staff, and he was supposedly their defensive coordinator and was an assistant coach. They came very close to beating the Bucks in the playoffs, the Bucks team that ended up winning the title. And that's like the one time the Nets have been any good, is when he was on the staff, and that was without Kyrie because he got hurt in the series. It was out without Harden basically because he got hurt in the series, and KD was incredible. And so you think, okay, like he has a great relationship with these guys and with Simmons and his time in Philadelphia, and it's going to work. But there's just no way you can possibly predict anything positive moving forward for Brooklyn under whatever head coach. He brings his own baggage to a team that already has a ton of distractions, and it's incredible that they've gotten where they have. Because at the time that they made the move in 2019, of course, as a fan, I'm excited. I'm like, let's bring in KD and Kyrie. Like, I've never rooted for guys like this on my team. Like, I became a Nets fan man, when they had like Jason Kidd and Vince Carter, Richard Jefferson, like those guys are incredible, but they're not on the same level as someone like Kevin Durant. Being able to watch Kevin Durant on my team for the last couple of seasons has been an incredible experience. But when you're talking about blame, like some of the blame still has to go to those guys as well, because a lot of the moves that they have made since 2019, again, from a front office that prior to 2019 made a lot of the correct decisions and since then has not, a lot of those moves, or at least some of them, were heavily influenced by Kevin Durant. For example, bringing in DeAndre Jordan on the contract initially, and the fact that that led to Kenny Atkinson wanting to play Jared Allen over DeAndre Jordan, and that DeAndre Jordan and that creating like this disconnect. Ultimately, I think that's what got Kenny Atkinson fired. That was a Kevin Durant thing. That was a Kyrie Irving thing. They didn't really gel with Kenny Atkinson. They wanted to bring in their own coach that, you know, wasn't there prior to them getting there. And the DeAndre Jordan thing was weird. And so Kenny Atkinson is gone. That's a Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving thing. DeAndre Jordan being brought in the first place. That's a Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving thing. Jared Allen being moved in the James Harden deal and trading for James Harden initially, which really, you know, took away a lot of the depth pieces and of course future first round picks and assets and things from this Brooklyn team. That was a Kevin Durant and a Kyrie Irving thing. I don't think that they were really all that in on that until those two guys really started to push for that. And ironically, that's the move that should have worked. The James Harden thing, as much of a disaster it has become, I think those guys played like 13 or 14 games together, all three together and healthy. They were unbelievable when those three guys played together. And in that era, even in, you know, when they only had two of them or three of them or whatever, or two of them or one of them, whatever the case may be, they were an unbelievable team and a team that arguably should have won at least one title. And that actually is the move that they should have made. I'm okay with that move. I'm just not okay with the fact, obviously, that Harden ended up leaving and everything completely fell apart. And again, I think a lot of that goes to KD and Kyrie and their relationship with Harden and believing that in the first place, and then that ultimately falling apart and him ending up in Philadelphia, and now Ben Simmons being there as well. And it's just this trail of just bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, and each one of them becoming more and more desperate, right? So like you bring in KD and Kyrie every single time. Like you have to do it. Every team in the league would have done it, and it still presented a better opportunity to win a championship than just bringing back D'Angelo Russell and having, you know, the Kenny Atkinson fun 42 win team again. But giving them as much power as they did within the organization was probably a mistake, right? And that ultimately led to the DeAndre Jordan thing. And then out of desperation, they're like, hey, I don't really want to, like, you know, kind of take some of that power and control back from KD and Kyrie. So I want to kind of just let them kind of do what they want. And so ultimately Kenny Atkinson goes. They have a lot of input on bringing in Steve Nash, which ultimately was a mistake as well. Then you make the Harden trade. He's like, hey, we got to make this happen. We got to try and win a title. They really want to bring in Harden. So you make that trade. Again, you can see we're getting a little bit more desperate here. Now the Harden thing doesn't work out. He wants to leave. Desperation strikes again. You trade for Simmons. You do all these other things in terms of the roster this upcoming season. Things don't go well to start this season. KD, or in the offseason, KD wants to request a trade. He wants to get rid of Steve Nash and Sean Marks. You're like, hey, no, we don't really want to do that. We get more desperate as the season starts. Steve Nash gets fired. Now you bring in Ime Udoka, who is only available to be the head coach of the Nets because he cannot be the coach of the Celtics because he's suspended for a year because of improper conduct, and all of that just feels continually more and more desperate. And at this point, as a fan, it is difficult for me to continue to be optimistic because through every single one of these moves, I have been optimistic, right? So bringing KD and Kyrie in the first place, that's exciting. The DeAndre Jordan thing, whatever, like I could understand it from a personality perspective. I love Jared Allen. I didn't want Jared Allen to go. He was in the Harden trade. It's like, hey, we probably were going to have to get rid of pretty much all of our assets to bring in Harden. That ended up working. You know, then when Simmons got brought in, it was like, he's actually perfect for the roster. I was kind of over having Harden on the team at that point. Getting rid of Nash, like that makes sense. Udoka, maybe he will have a better relationship with these guys and get them to play defense and all that. But it's just not a very good roster outside of Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. I think that is the thing that ultimately I go back to, is that it blows my mind that if you want to place blame and things like that, like a lot of the blame for this does have to fall on Sean Marks, because whether KD and Kyrie had input or influence or whatever the case may be on the front office decisions and the personnel decisions with Steve Nash and otherwise, ultimately those things still fall on you as the GM, because you brought in KD and Kyrie in the first place, gave them that power and gave them that influence, and then ultimately kind of did what they wanted you to do in those moves. And a lot of the blame ultimately I do think falls on Sean Marks, and it's crazy because again, he took what it was probably the worst situation that the league had seen in 20 years and turned it into a situation within 3 years without first round picks, with aging veteran players you're the secondary market in your secondary team in your own market. And he brings in KD and Kyrie, builds a championship level team in 3.5 or 4 years. And then everything since then has fallen apart. And you can say that some of those things were out of his control. Obviously, if that Nets team is healthy in that Milwaukee series, I certainly believe they would have beaten Milwaukee, probably won the title that year. And there's nothing you can do about the fact that James Harden pulls his hamstring and Kyrie sprains his ankle. Like there's nothing you can do about that. And I understand that. But at the same time, when you look at the depth on this roster, when you look at, there's not a single player on this team apart from maybe Royce O'Neal that can guard and shoot. Like there isn't one. I mean, KD, if he wants to try, he can guard, but there's not a single player on the roster that can guard and can space the floor. And that's the way championship teams are built. When you look around the league at Boston, Phoenix, Milwaukee, like all these teams have guys that can guard and shoot, and Brooklyn does not have a single one. And it is just ultimately a broken broken team and a broken organization. And if Ime Udoka can come in and fix this team in a way that, you know, they're suddenly this contender again and they're guarding, and he's a miracle worker. He just is. And maybe that will end up happening. But the lesson from this, I think, is one, whatever the dynamic was supposed to be between KD and Kyrie, ultimately, obviously, has not worked. And there's big question marks about those guys' ability to be, you know, culture setters and like foundational pieces of your team, even if, you know, they are obviously incredibly talented. And that even raises further questions about the championships that KD won in Golden State and could have even done that outside of that environment that very clearly had a really strong structure prior to him getting there. There's just a lot of question marks about those guys moving forward. And I think a lot of the blame goes to a lot of different places, whether it be Nash, whether it be Marks, whether it be KD and Kyrie. And it's actually insane to me that this has fallen apart as badly as it has. And who knows, maybe 3 months from now, they're the 3 seed in the East and Udoka has them playing defense and everything's fine. But given the baggage he's bringing with him, given the distractions that are already there on this team, it feels like a team that is certainly headed towards disaster and a team that maybe should have just gone forward with a Kevin Durant trade this past offseason.